Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Redesigning the Workplace for Productivity. For those of you online, you'll know that you've connected to this webinar via Slido. So if you do have any questions at all throughout the presentation, please pop them into the Q&A box and our presenter will answer these at the end of his presentation today. So I'd now like to welcome Andrew Barnes. Andrew has made a career of market-changing innovation, most recently as the founder of Perpetual Guardian. His announcement and implementation of the 4-day week made headlines around the world. He has established 4-day week global, enabling interested parties to connect and advance this idea as part of the future of work, and was on the advisory boards of both the US and Ireland 4-day week campaigns and the Wellbeing Research Centre at Oxford University. Previously, Andrew was chairman of realestate.com.au, managing director of Australian Wealth Management Limited, and CEO of Best Invest, a UK investment advisory company. Andrew sits on the board of the Antarctic Heritage Trust, the New Zealand War Memorial Museum, and the King's Trust Aotearoa, New Zealand. Andrew also holds an MA from Selwyn College in Cambridge. So I'd now like to hand you over to our presenter today, Andrew.
Good afternoon, everybody. I always feel a little bit of a fraud when I am invited to talk about what everybody thinks is a concept of making life, certainly from a business perspective, a little bit easier in terms of the 4-day week. So what I thought I'd do is go back a little bit to the genesis of the idea, because actually I'm quite frankly quite a hard-nosed businessman. My whole premise of exploring a change to the way in which we work wasn't driven by a desire to see better work-life balance. That is actually something that does actually flow from the 4-day week. But really what prompted me to do it was actually thinking about productivity. And specifically, I was on a plane flying to London and I was reading The Economist magazine, which had a series of articles on productivity, or rather the lack of it. And what they were focusing on was two countries, the UK and Canada. Now, the research from the UK indicated that true productivity was about 2.5 to 3 hours a day. And in the Canadian study, they were suggesting that productivity, true productivity, was about 1.5 hours a day. Now, this came as a little bit of an eye-opener as far as I was concerned. And I was trying to work out, was that actually happening in my business? That prompted me to take a step back and to look at my company, which was Perpetual Guardian. Now, I already knew from looking at the data that was dropping out of we're similar to a law firm in many ways. So we are able for a portion of the business to look at the proportion of billable time. And I was looking at that and seeing that that was generally frozen around the 60% mark, maybe in some terms down to about 50%. And so I knew that there was unproductive time within a portion of the company. What I then started to think about is how the normal working day evolves. And if you think about that, you come into the office, you sit down, you have a chat, you have a cup of coffee, maybe you then go on the internet, read the paper a little bit, then you start doing some work, and then you get interrupted. Then you get back to doing some work, and this pattern generally recurs throughout the day. In fact, things like open plan offices have actually been a major destroyer of productivity. And why do I say that? It's because statistically, in an open plan office, you are interrupted once every 11 minutes. And it takes you about 22 minutes to get back to full productivity. There's another great statistic that if you are continually interrupted within your workday, then that is the equivalent of a 10-point drop in your IQ or operating under the influence of marijuana. So what I started to say is, well, how do I change this? What is it about the modern workplace and, to be honest, modern society that is causing this poor apparent level of productivity? Now, I should be clear here that, frankly, this statistics about productivity, it's consistent across industry. It's a lot easier sometimes to measure in a manufacturing business how much time is being spent versus a service industry. But nevertheless, the consistency appears to be that there is a material amount of unproductive time within a working day. So the challenge that we set ourselves that then evolved into the 4-day week was to say, well, how do you identify what that is? And a little bit of it is environmental. Environmental in that if you have an open plan office, if you've got lots of people that are coming on to telephones all the time, if you've got quite often things like meeting tables within banks of desks, it's a standard layout so we can all have our breakout. All of these create a level of noise and disruption which impacts the work that everybody else does. So environmental is a little bit of that. The next key point is that we find that things like the internet and email, which on the one hand have improved communication, means that we get inundated with large amounts of information, messaging, often that isn't really relevant to the jobs that we're doing. So, for example, things like, the greatest destroyer of time is probably the reply all option on your mail. So you get hundreds of emails, which you then have to clear. You think back to the days of snail mail, you might get 5-10 letters in a day. Here you're getting messages that are coming at you, not just in volume, but are coming at you all the time. You've then got a mobile phone. Now, the mobile phone is fairly similar in that it too means that you are always in touch and that people can both message you, call you, and also it's a temptation. I'm just going to check the internet. And again, you will see that people check their mobile phones continually throughout the day. Now, they do that on the shilling, on the time of business. It's broadly a fact of life. It was one of the interesting things that when we implemented a 4-day week of Perpetual Guardian, one of the tests that we ran was to see what was the change to the amount of time people spent surfing the top 5 internet sites in New Zealand that were non-business related. And we found that as a consequence of the program, that dropped 35%. So it was quite a significant shift in behavior. And then I think finally you have a simpler social change. So if we look back over, the last certainly several decades, we've now got a situation that both adults and a family often are working. You're needing to do that in order to generate, the money to pay for the lifestyles that we now want and demand. Yet, if you go back 50 years, there was always one person, largely the male, who was working, and one person, largely the female, who wasn't. And what that meant is that 2 things happened. One, family was the preserve of the person at home, but it also meant that there was a capability to do things like volunteering, helping out. What we have seen over the last 50 years is increasingly we are being interrupted at work to do all of those domestic family issues. I've got to take the kid to the doctors, or I've got to go and visit the school, or what have you. Those things are occurring now in a way that never occurred really 50 years ago. Now, this isn't a criticism of that. This is purely an observation and the starting point for rethinking how we work. It is my contention that the real problem that we face today is a lack of time. Now, that time is time for family, it's time for community, and it's also time for self. Now, just as with a computer or a piece of equipment, from time to time, you turn it off, you reboot it, you give it a chance to reset itself. It's interesting that when you look at the human machine, we don't do the same. In fact, you can see that there are some organizations that will argue that, you should be looking for 996, work from 9 to 9, and you can do that 6 days a week. And there is no impact on productivity. It is clear from the research that that is not the case. So when we set out to do the trial at Perpetual Guardian, which we involved Auckland University and Auckland University of Technology in, the idea was that we wanted to see if we changed how we worked, what would the impact be on the business, but also what would the impact be on the employees. Now, the results were quite remarkable. Now, in order to make this work, what we actually had to do was basically involve all of the employees as part of a process of rethinking how work was to be done. Because at the end of the day, it's very easy in a organization to turn around and say, look, I'm going to bring in a consultant. The consultant looks at the organization, says there's a whole pile of inefficiency here, reshapes it, delivers it, and the message that most employees in the company understand is when you do process re-engineering, what you actually are going to result in is job losses, and usually asking employees to do more with less. The premise of the 4-day week model, what we call the 100-80-100 model, that's 100% pay, 80% time, provided we get 100% of normal 5-day week productivity, is actually to involve the employee in that process. And the benefit to the employee comes in the shape of more time off. The benefit to the organization comes in the fact that they are not seeing a drop in productivity. In fact, the research indicates to the contrary, that in fact productivity goes up. The question, of course, is how does this happen? Because inevitably, wherever I travel around the world, I have conversations with business leaders who tell me that this is not going to work, it could never work, or more usually, it might work over there, but it wouldn't work in my business. So what's the starting point? What's the flaw that we're currently seeing in a lot of current businesses? Again, one of the questions that I keep getting when I talk about the 4-day week, the individual turns around and says, well, how do you measure productivity? How do you measure productivity? So what that is saying to me is actually most businesses aren't measuring productivity. They may well measure the amount of items that they produce, the ultimate output. They may measure time. we have a view that if I work 40 hours a week, that is clearly going to deliver more than 32 hours a week. Again, evidence around the world would suggest that that is not necessarily the case, but that presumes that you are productive for every hour, every minute, every second of the time in which you're working. And the start point for my journey was the recognition that that actually is not the case, and that actually a lot of the working day is filled with either unproductive activity, completely non-productive activity, and a very small component is productive. So quite simply, the math that I did at the start was to say that if my staff were only actually productive for 3 hours a day, I only had to find 45 minutes of additional productivity in each of 4 days in order to produce the same output over 5 days, over 4 days rather than 5. Now, that was the thesis. And obviously, that of itself is not relevant if you don't do research. So as I said, we actually had researchers working alongside the Perpetual Guardian trial. But then it went further than that. We were inundated with people calling from around the world wanting to understand about the trial. So we created an organization called 4 Day Week Global. Now, 4 Day Week Global has subsequently run trials in about 20 countries worldwide, everywhere from, Japan, India, Brazil, Portugal, through the usuals, the United States, Canada, the UK, and so on. In many ways, the research has been somewhat boring in that what it has demonstrated again and again is a consistency of output. Namely, that productivity actually goes up. In some cases, and I think the US trial was probably the most indicative of this, actually productivity improved by about 30%. Now that's absolute productivity. That isn't productivity within each of the hours of a reduced working week. That's absolute productivity. Output increased by 30%. Sick days halved, on average about 67% down across all the surveys. We found that it was easier to attract and retain people, even in extremely hot markets. For example, the technology market a few years ago in the US was very, very hot indeed. And what they were finding was actually their ability to attract staff to a business operating on a 4-day week was far higher, and staff turnover also dropped markedly. As far as the employees were concerned, stress levels dropped, 40%. Engagement scores went off the scale, again, generally up 40, 50%. More people said they were better able to do their job working 4 days rather than 5. And the concept of teamwork also increased massively across all of these organizations. So on the face of it, the data, and this data was being collated by a combination of Boston College in the United States, Oxford University, Cambridge University, and actually wherever else we were running a trial, we usually had a local university. So for example, in South Africa, we had Stellenbosch that would be the local partner of the trial, in order that we could determine that we were actually doing things in a way that gelled for the local community and the local society. So what we saw consistently across these, and these were 6-month trials run with hundreds of companies, hundreds of thousands of employees. with everything from, a two-person fish and chip shop in Norfolk, all the way through to big organisations like Unilever or Lamborghini or Panasonic, that we found that there was a consistent benefit as far as the organisation was concerned. What we also found is that there were actually usually fairly simple solutions that enabled you to pick up an improvement in productivity. One of the great experiments here was conducted by Microsoft in Japan. What Microsoft did in Japan is they said, righto, no more than 5 people in a meeting. Please use Microsoft Teams, and no meeting is to last more than half an hour. Now, I think we all know there are plenty of times that we are pulled into meetings where there is no set agenda, where the meeting drags on for an awful long period of time. So Microsoft said simply, right, those 3 things. Productivity in Microsoft Japan, as a consequence of that one action, went up 39.9%. Just simply eliminating unnecessary meetings across the organisation. So the real premise of what we are trying to do when we talk about implementing reduced hours working on full pay but maintaining productivity is to focus often not on what it is you're doing, but focus on what it is you shouldn't be doing. And that can be the meetings, it can be avoiding interruptions, it can be, personal life intruding into the working day. So by changing the dynamic and by saying to employees, actually, you get the benefit of this change. You're actually incentivizing and empowering the workforce to come up with the solution. And one of the other key parts that came out of the global research was that we asked employees that had gone through a 4-day week trial, we asked them to quantify how much more we would have to pay them to go back to working 5 days a week, having worked 4 days a week. And this was quite instructive. So 15% said there is no amount of money that you can pay me that will induce me to go back to 5 days. Another 15% said you're going to have to pay me at least 75% more to go back. About 40% then said actually it's really going to have to be over 50%. And the next category broadly was you're going to have to pay me more than 25% more. Now, so what this is showing is that people value the time off that they get at a higher price, higher dollar value per hour than the amount that you are paying for it. And that's the incentive that makes a redesign of a workforce and a working environment possible, because the incentive goes equally to the employer in the form of better productivity, etc., but critically to the employee in the form of more time off. Now, we also then sat there and said, well, having done this, what do people do with the time? Well, they spend more time with their families. They spend more time volunteering. They do education, improving themselves. They spend more time cooking. They get fit. Now, once you start looking across these things and then think about the challenges that face the modern world, quite often it's the fact we have obesity. We don't have as much family cohesion. We don't have the volunteering organisations that we used to have. You look at the fact that, organisations like Rotary are withering on the vine because they can't get people to spend the time that they used to, because the workday has basically expanded, and with both parents having to work, there isn't the ability for one or the other parent to not go home and spend time with the family. Now, Rotary is an organisation cured polio globally, so we lose these organisations at our peril. So when you create an environment that gives people more time, then you start to see benefits that flow not just to the organisation, but then to the broader society. Indeed, when we did the research in the United Kingdom, calculations indicated that if the UK moved to a productivity-focused 4-day week, it would be the equivalent in carbon emission of taking the entire UK private car fleet off the road every year. And again, look at the challenges that we're all facing from an environmental perspective. Just changing how we work might actually have a bigger impact on the reduction of carbon emission than almost anything else that we may choose to do. Now, all of this, of course, sounds absolutely fabulous, but actually, practically, how do you do this? Because this is not something that actually any individual leadership team can actually force its employees to do. This actually has to be a decision which involves everybody in the workplace, because ultimately the thing that is going to make this work is as much about a change of behaviour as it is about a change of process. So let's get to basics. What does reduced hours working really mean? Well, I'll tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean closing your business for a day. It doesn't mean shortening your hours of operation. If anything, you can probably increase them with this. What it means is rethinking how it is you are going to service your customers and deliver what you do to your customers whilst reducing the working week. Now, effectively, what that means is you are implementing forms of shift work. If you think about the medical profession, superficially, it works 7 days a week, but there isn't a doctor or a nurse who works 7 days a week. They work shift work. And certainly when we implemented this at Perpetual Guardian, we could not close our business, and we didn't. So we end up with a operation where we said to people, right, when do you want to work? When do we need you to work? And we created a methodology where, as much as possible, we gave people the time off that was important to them. It's not always, by the way, a Friday or a Monday, but at the same time meant that we could fulfill our business objectives. And frankly, you couldn't always get a Friday off. If everybody wanted Friday off, that had to be done on a rotational basis. So first of all, it's not closing it down. So we have people who work 4 days a week. We have people who take 2 afternoons off a week. We have people who work 5 days a week, but compressed hours. And that's usually working parents, which means they can drop their kids off at school and pick them up from school. And then we have about 15% of the organisation at any point in time that works 5 days a week. Now, some of those are new employees to the organization. And the reason we do that is because they need to understand the outputs we are looking to get in a conventional 5-day week. And then we drop them down to 4 days. But then we have another bunch of people who just want to work as they did before. Well, that's fine. I don't pay them anymore because actually I'm not paying for the amount of time you sit in the seat. I'm paying for what it is you produce. So the first thing you have to rethink what that means. What does reduced working hours really mean? The second thing is you have to be clear that it is about output. It's not about cramming everything into 4 days, working 40 hours over 4 days. It is about getting rid of the things that you shouldn't be doing. It is about empowering employees to find small hacks and big hacks in terms of their process. And it is about measuring output. Now, that means you actually have to come up with matrices for that, but that's okay. That's part and parcel of the process when you look to try and trial a 4-day week that you need to do, which is to sit there and work out what measurements can you do to ensure that productivity is remaining at the right level. Now, in all of this, there is no single solution. You have to know what is going to work in your organization, as opposed to me sitting here and saying, we'll try and do it that way. But in each case, with all the organizations that have gone into the trials, they have sat down to try and address that particular point. The second key issue, and this is from a business point of view, is to understand that the salary input and the salary cost is merely only one of the expenses that an organisation have. Things like staff recruitment and onboarding, absenteeism, burnout. What we found when we were doing some research in from the UK point of view, that they found, and these are the straight statistics, 54% increase in self-reported productivity, 100% plus increase in quality applicants, 65% reduction in absenteeism, 71% report less burnout, 1 in 3 had a reduction in work stress, and there was a 57% reduction in the resignation rate. And what that translated to was, in essence, a material saving per, say, 10 to 15 staff of something approaching to $250,000 per 15 staff. Material benefits to the organization that actually are often the things that we forget when we just look at the premise of saying, actually, if I reduce the amount of hours you have to work, then my output goes down. There is a particular example in terms of output that I wanted to share with you, and this relates to the City of Golden Police Force. So there again, here is an emergency service, first responder, 24/7, who have transitioned to a 4-day week. What did they find? Well, they found reduced vacancies. So they actually managed to get the police force fully staffed. They found their emergency response times improved. They found the relationship between the police and the community improved. And they found that their overtime bill, perversely, actually went down. And I do recommend that if you have the chance, you can see them on YouTube, the head of the City of Golden Police Force talking about the benefits of rethinking how people worked to his organization. The second part of this is you have to think about how you redesign your workplace. So the starting is to do the groundwork. Think about what you can feasibly change operationally, culturally, financially, and start with an experiment, a structured experiment. You can do that in, you can do it in a department. You could do it in a portion of the business. Small businesses, of course, can do it right the way across. But the whole concept of this is to trial the concept before you go full bore. And in most cases, what we have recommended is a 6-month trial to a 9-month trial, as that generally spreads across cyclical patterns throughout the year. You must include the skeptics in that co-design process early. And you have to be transparent. This is not about, I'm going to bring this so you get a benefit, or I'm bringing this because I'm going to better benefit. There has to be shared ownership of the concept. This is a thing, when I introduced it to my own business, I said, look, if you take this seriously, I'm going to take this seriously. But if nobody takes this seriously, if you don't take ownership, then ultimately this will fail. Because at the heart of this is I am gifting as an employer something that is incredibly valuable, which is the gift of time. One of my employees was a grandfather. He used to spend his 2 afternoons off a week going down, spent time with his granddaughter. And when I talked to him about the impact of the 4-day week, he cried, because he never thought that he was going to be able to have the time with his granddaughter the way the 4-day week enabled him to do. Now, I mention that simply to say there was nothing that individual would not have done to hang on to his 4-day week. It was so important. This is the concept of time being more valuable than the amount that we pay for it. And then the next stage is that you actually have to measure it. Outputs. You have to think about getting the right data so you understand what it is that we are measuring to ensure that we're delivering outputs. There's a very controversial experiment going on, for example, in a council in the UK at the moment. It keeps getting slapped over the head by the government. And yet, having implemented a 4-day week, I think 14 of the 17 measurements that are applied to councils, that they have actually seen improvements and they are operating above the national standard. And the key point here is they are able to continue to demonstrate that actually this works. And then the sort of the final point is that at the end of the day, there is no one solution as far as this is concerned. What works for me will not necessarily work for you. This is part of a process where you have to start to rethink how we're going to work, how we're going to remove the roadblocks, and what is it that we can do. Now, let me explain a little bit what we did, or the outputs that we did in Perpetual Guardian. So we did some very simple things. Yes, we did the meeting restriction. We changed the size of people's desks. We made them a little bit smaller. That gave us a little bit more room to create a much larger proper breakout area. We removed the desks that sat between the banks of desks, because you know what, having a meeting there was always more interesting than the thing that you were doing. Because we had a bigger breakout area, we said to people, don't eat your lunch anymore at your desk. Because you know, if somebody is eating a nice reheated curry next to you and you're approaching lunchtime, the chances are you're focusing on how hungry you are as opposed to actually getting on with your job. We created the concept of a quiet hour. So in a quiet hour, you could put your headphones on, you could not be interrupted, and you were not allowed to be interrupted for an hour. Now, using the data of once every 11 minutes and 22 minutes to get back to full productivity, that hour was actually the equivalent of 3 hours of normal productivity. So actually, right there, we were generating additional productivity equivalent to that 1.5 that I was looking for in order to be able to drop the working week from, the 5 days to 4 days. So, very, very simple rules. We had another rule which said if you can't trust yourself to not look at your mobile phone, there was a locker in the corner that you could lock your mobile phone away. If we did have open plan meeting areas, they were cushioned by high-backed, soft furnished chairs, so the sound was deadened. So none of those things was significant process re-engineering. What we then found, of course, because people knew that as a team they had to hit the targets, and if they didn't hit the targets, they would lose the 4-day week. They worked more collaboratively. They stopped wasting each other's time. They were far more respectful of other people's time in order to make them hit their goals. So that was where we saw the teamwork scores, literally going off the scale. They also identified lots of small hacks that meant we could improve the process. Now, once upon a time, no one would have ever told you about these because they didn't want to tell you. If they told you, they might have lost a bit of their job or they might have lost their job. But when the benefit of finding a time hack flows to them in the form of reduced hours working, they let you know what these are. Now, the net result is that we are broadly today twice as productive on a per capita basis as our nearest competitor in the sector. Twice as productive with a reduced hours working policy. So this is not some crazy idea. This is now being experimented with around the world. You've got countries that have gone to it. So the UAE, Iceland have gone. You've got major trials in Spain, Brazil. The metropolitan government in Tokyo has just introduced it. Different reason there. They've done it to try and improve the birth rate because actually, if you give people more time, they might actually have more kids. Critical issue for Japan. But this has now gone from being a crazy idea to a mainstream idea. The big issue now is that what I'm encouraging everybody to do is think about it and to not just reject it out of hand, but to think about how they could apply it in your own businesses. Because 200 years ago, a lot of people would sit there and say, well, we can't possibly drop the working week from 7 days a week to 6 days a week. Or 100 years ago, from 6 days a week to 5 days a week. I mean, that's actually a creation of Henry Ford, broadly brought in the 5-day week in order that he could create a weekend so people would buy his cars. The premise is that the way we work today is a construct of the 19th century, early 20th century. It isn't a construct or something that is relevant to the 21st. And so we've got all of these tools that enable us to think about, measure productivity, but what we've actually got to do is start to rebalance it so that our human capital can work just as efficiently as our technology and our machinery. Thank you. Happy to take some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. That was absolutely phenomenal. And I was certainly riveted to my seat throughout. Now, we've had a few questions come through. And so for those who are in the call, feel free to keep adding some more in. But so far what I've done is I've tried to distill those into a bunch of key themes. And so 4 key themes have come across, and I'll just ask you kind of questions related to those. The first theme was around role variability and kind of practical constraints. And so the question is, does the 4-day work week work for all roles? Like for example, in some roles, especially manual or physical ones, you can only go so fast. And so does this model assume that people in any role are naturally not working productively?
Yeah, actually, that is true. I mean, this is why I said you've got to recognize that actually the data looks at both. It's gone across farms, logistics, manufacturing, service, health, all the way across. There are things that stop people being productive. They are not just time. It is things like burnout, injury, emotional stress, all sorts of things. Now, interestingly, I think in the comment you talk about somebody says you can only go so fast. That's true. People who are tired make more mistakes often. So what you've got to do with this model is to step away, not naturally assume that just because we think it isn't applicable. You've got to go to the individual's concern, say, what is stopping you being productive? Now, sometimes that change, and I'll give you a good example. In the back of my book, I remember sitting in Wellington and a guy came, I was in an MP's office and a chap sat next to me and he said, well, it wouldn't work in the dairy industry because cows need milking twice a day. Now, for those of you who watch and study an organisation in New Zealand called Halter, you can now milk your cows from your living room. There is technology that can start to use to improve productivity in all things. That's what you're trying to deal with.
Thank you. The next question's around kind of sustainability over time. So if you see an initial productivity lift where teams deliver 100% output in 80% of the time, is there a risk that attitudes shift over time and productivity eventually drops to 80%? And how do organizations sustain performance and avoid sliding back?
Yeah, there is a massive experiment that demonstrates that this is a real danger, and it's called the French. So France implemented the 35-hour week, but it wasn't linked to output or productivity. So what they found, in the short term, productivity improved and then it dropped. The way we deal with that in our organization, the way, in fact, the 4-day week global recommended approach is that my team's contracts of employment are still for 5 days a week, 39 hours. They then sign what we call the opt-in agreement for the 4-day week. And what that basically means is a compact between them and the organization where it says, look, provided productivity goals are met, we will enable you to have another, 40 odd days off a year. If you don't, and it doesn't, then the organization has the right to say, okay, everybody back to 5 days. Now, as a consequence of that, we have never, in the years that we've been implementing, which is now about 5 years, we've never had to do that. And that's the whole point about this. It becomes a muscle memory in the end, and that people continue to focus on it. If you don't have it linked to productivity, though, you're absolutely right. That is the risk, that actually eventually people default to the way they've worked before, which is they start to bring in the inefficiencies and the unproductive activity.
Thank you. Third question is really around flexibility and ways of working. So does the 4-day week typically include working from home? And what does the research tell us about combining reduced hours with remote or hybrid models?
It frankly doesn't make a difference. We have Perpetual Guardian has a bit of a working from home policy as well. So remember, as long as you're measuring output, and that's one of the things that we didn't really do with the working from home movement either, as long as you're measuring output and the output is consistent, you're not seeing it drop, then actually you can do this with a working from home model, you can do it from an office-based model. One of the benefits of the 4-day week, though, is it sort of combines a little bit of the two. What it really says is, look, you have more time off, and that's all to do with all the stuff that's important to you. But actually, working in an office for 4 days or 3 days a week as part of that process means that I'm still getting all the benefits of having more time off. I'm also getting the benefits of being able to interact with my colleagues. So we are seeing that some organizations quite like it because it strengthens the argument for a bit of that cooperation and community in an office or a factory for a few days a week. And quite often you'll see therefore a 3-1-1 model, 1 day off, 1 day home, 3 days in. And it's a decent balance. But to be clear, it's irrelevant where you work. We are focusing on, can you do the job for which you are paid and deliver the productivity at the right level?
Awesome, thank you. The next question is around business models, charging structures, and value creation. In the surveying profession, much of our work follows a traditional consulting model where we charge on time and disbursements. Do you have a view on how reduced hours or increased efficiency interacts with that model? So I guess in other words, if we complete the work faster, does that simply reduce chargeable time, or does it shift the value proposition in a different way?
The best example I can give you on this is a business called Y Law, which is based out of Vancouver in Canada. It's one of Canada's fastest growing law firms. And so what they did is they went to a 4-day week. One of their biggest problems, they were losing staff. And so remember, when you're thinking about how efficient your business is, if you keep losing surveyors or whatever because they're leaving the company, then whilst you may be okay on a traditional model, if you're losing staff and you're having to keep recruiting them, that's sort of costing you time and costing you money. So what they thought was, we'll bring this in, we might see a change. They thought they were going to see a reduction in output of about 10%. They added efficiency, their profits increased by over 30%, and on it went. Now, part of that, we're just as guilty as this. We have a bit of our business quotes on time. Now, actually, this is because we're not thinking. We use time because it's a surrogate for measuring output. It isn't a measure of output. So I've always asked my team, and quite often when I do these talks, if you think about how bonkers this is, you have let's say two engineering consultancies, and one takes a day to do a piece of work, and one takes 2 days to do a piece of work. The piece of work is otherwise identical, so it's worth the same amount. Why is the more efficient firm charging half the price of the less efficient? And so this is where using time as a surrogate for output goes wrong. Actually, as a customer, I'm interested in the value of that. I'm interested in the value to me. I'm frankly not interested in how long it takes you. The reason we do that is we are lazy in our professions, and it's easier for us to go, if I know that's taken 10 minutes, I know that I can charge X amount for the 10 minutes and I can put a margin on it. But actually, if we're being honest with ourselves, that's purely because of the inefficiency of our own thinking and process. What you actually should do is putting a fixed price on that. That fixed price is the value to the consumer. It's either worth it for them or not. And then actually, the more efficient you make yourself, the more money you make, rather than actually just time expanding to fill the size of the contract available.
Thank you. So I just had two more questions, if that's okay. One is around AI technology and the future of productivity. So given everything you've shared about genuine productivity versus digital noise, how do you see AI shaping the future of the 4-day week? So how would we distinguish real productivity gains from false kind of signals created by AI tools? And what does good performance discipline look like when technology can both help and hinder capability?
Well, I mean, the start point is to say, why is this any different from somebody working 5 days? Right? It's the same problem applies, right? We have a workforce. We are assuming that we need X amount of people to work for X period of time in order to generate Y of output. The AI issue impacts that in an identical form to the way it impacts a 4-day week. There is no difference. It's all about understanding how many people you need, how productive they are, and how they can measure it. If AI improves that, fantastic. You'd obviously need to rethink how many bodies you need, but it doesn't really change the fundamentals. What I find more interesting, actually, though, is that AI has a potential to be eye-poppingly disruptive as far as our economy is concerned. And one of the things that we noted in some of the trials was that if an organization repositioned itself to a 4-day week and created a day a week that was free, one of its options and one of the employees' options was to upskill and retrain and reposition themselves to be able to meet the challenges of AI and to rethink how they would fit into that, versus a situation where if you haven't got time, the organization probably defaults to bringing in AI processes and looking just to drop headcount. And actually, that will create a social problem down the track if we're not rethinking how we re-educate our people in order to mean that they have the right skills to meet the challenges. Equally, more time off means those industries not impacted by AI, hospitality, etc., actually will have an uptick in the market. It's no different in a way from Henry Ford reducing the working week from 6 days to 5 days. So people had a weekend. If they had a weekend, then it wasn't just about going to church on Sunday. It was going to the beach on Saturday. Therefore, they bought a car. Hence, he created a business. There is probably something similar lurking in the AI revolution.
Awesome, thank you. Now, I hope you don't mind if I ask one last quick question, which is, you've now had visibility into trials in more than 20 countries. Based on that global picture, what do you think is the next big shift in work design? What do you think that will be beyond the 4-day week?
Well, I think the key one is I'd like to see the 4-day week rather more global than anything else. Maynard Keynes said actually that in reality we should be working 15 hours a week. And if you believe that we're only truly productive for 3 hours a day, then in effect we are really only working 15 hours a week. So in the end, our society will be better if there is a good balance between the amount of time that we work, the amount of time we spend with our families and the amount of time we spend in society. So I would think that hopefully this is merely the step on a road which ultimately creates a better and more sustainable world.
Thank you. And look, thank you so much, Andrew. We really, really appreciate you taking the time to share your insights today. Your perspective on genuine productivity, how we design work, and what the future might hold has given us certainly an awful lot to think about, and the feedback that's been coming through has been fantastic. So thank you again very much for the generosity of your time and for being with us this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.